Some places don't wait for crowds, the old fisherman whispered at the gas station near Route 9. They wait for one broken soul to finally come home. Caleb Mercer heard the words but kept walking through the cold rain with his German shepherd beside him. The town of Grayhaven, Maine, looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. Salt-covered windows. Empty storefronts. Rusted lobster traps stacked beside weathered docks. Somewhere beyond the thick ocean fog, a lonely lighthouse stood against the black Atlantic like a ghost refusing to disappear. Caleb pulled his army jacket tighter around his shoulders as icy wind rolled in from the sea. He had $43 left in his pocket, half a tank of gas in his old Ford pickup, and nowhere to sleep except the truck bed he shared with Rex. The dog suddenly stopped walking. His ears lifted toward a narrow bakery near the corner of Harbor Street. Warm yellow light spilled softly through the rain-covered windows. Caleb sighed. "Not tonight, buddy." But Rex didn't move. The German shepherd stared silently at the bakery door as if listening to something Caleb couldn't hear. Then the dog let out a low whine. Caleb frowned. Rex almost never did that. Especially not without reason. Thunder rolled across the shoreline. The bakery sign above the door swayed in the wind. Vale's Bread and Pie. EST 1972. One of the hinges on the front door banged hard against the frame again and again. Caleb stepped closer and noticed an elderly woman inside struggling to pull the heavy door shut before the storm worsened. She was small and thin, wearing a faded blue sweater dusted with flour. Her cloudy eyes searched the darkness without focus. Caleb realized immediately that she couldn't see him clearly. Before he could speak, the woman called out softly, "I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever come." Caleb froze. Rain dripped from his beard onto the wooden porch. "Ma'am." She smiled faintly. "The dog found the place first, didn't he?" Rex walked straight toward her without hesitation, tail low and calm, like he already knew her. The woman rested one wrinkled hand gently against the dog's head. "Good boy," she whispered. "You remember." Caleb felt something strange move through his chest then. Not fear. Not comfort either. Something older. Like stepping into a memory he couldn't explain. Another violent gust slammed the loose door hinge sideways. Caleb instinctively grabbed it before the entire thing tore loose from the frame. "Hold on," he said. "This thing's about to come off." He spent the next 20 minutes in the freezing rain tightening screws with an old multi-tool from his truck while Rex stayed quietly beside the woman inside the bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the cracked doorway with the warmth of cinnamon, butter, and yeast. It smelled like a real home. Maybe the first one Caleb had stood near in years. When he finally stepped inside, soaked and shivering, the woman placed a warm loaf of sourdough into his hands without asking for $1. "Kindness always finds its way back," she said softly. Then somewhere far beyond the dark ocean fog, a lighthouse horn suddenly echoed through the storm even though the lighthouse itself had been abandoned for over 30 years. And beside the window, Rex slowly lifted his head toward the sea. The next morning, the storm had passed, but Grayhaven still looked wrapped in a cold blue silence. Seagulls drifted above the harbor. Fishing boats rocked gently against old wooden docks, and the smell of saltwater mixed with diesel fuel carried through the narrow streets. Caleb woke in the back of his truck with Rex already sitting upright beside the window, staring toward Harbor Street again. "You are not letting this go, are you?" Caleb muttered softly. Rex thumped his tail once against the blanket. Caleb had spent years learning to trust the dog's instincts. Back in Afghanistan, Rex had sensed danger before any man in Caleb's unit ever did. Sometimes Caleb believed the dog understood things no one else could. He started the truck, drove 2 blocks through town, and parked beside the bakery just as the morning fog rolled across the sidewalks. The warm scent hit him before he even opened the door. Fresh cinnamon rolls. Butter biscuits. Hot coffee. For a moment, standing there beneath the faded sign, Caleb almost forgot what it felt like. To be alone. Inside, Margaret Vale moved carefully behind the counter while soft jazz played from an old radio near the kitchen. She measured flour by touch alone, her thin fingers gliding across bowls and measuring cups with quiet confidence. Rex walked straight to her side again, settling beside her feet as though he had belonged there his whole life. Margaret smiled gently. "I was hoping you would come back." Caleb removed his wet jacket slowly. "I figured I still owed you for the bread." "No," she said softly. "People do not owe kindness. That is what makes it kindness." Those words stayed with him longer than he expected. Caleb spent the morning fixing loose shelves in the pantry while customers drifted in and out of the bakery. Most barely noticed him. Grayhaven was the kind of town where lonely people blended into the background like old wallpaper. But every now and then Caleb caught someone staring at Rex. Especially older fishermen. One man near the register lowered his voice and whispered to Margaret, "That dog keeps looking toward the lighthouse." Margaret paused for only a second. "Dogs remember things people forget," she replied quietly. The fisherman left without another word. Caleb frowned but said nothing. By noon the bakery smelled of blueberry pie and warm sugar. Sunlight filtered softly through the windows, turning dust particles golden in the air. Margaret handed Caleb a cup of clam chowder and motioned toward the stool near the counter. "Sit," she said. "You move like a man who forgot how to rest." Caleb sat reluctantly while Rex stretched out beside him on the old wooden floorboards. For several minutes the bakery remained peaceful except for the ticking wall clock and distant gulls outside. Then it came again. A low horn echoing faintly across the ocean. Caleb slowly looked up. The sound rolled through the fog like something ancient waking beneath the sea. Rex immediately lifted his head. Every muscle in the German shepherd's body tightened. "That is impossible," Caleb murmured. Margaret lowered her spoon carefully. Her clouded eyes drifted toward the window even though she could not see the shoreline beyond it. "No," she whispered softly. "Impossible things happen near that lighthouse all the time." Outside, beyond the harbor and the gray Atlantic fog, the lonely tower stood motionless against the cliffs. But for the briefest moment, Caleb could have sworn he saw a faint light moving behind the glass at the very top. That night the fog rolled in thicker than before, swallowing most of Grayhaven beneath a pale silver haze. The ocean sounded different after dark. Slower. Heavier. Like something breathing far beyond the cliffs. Caleb sat inside his truck parked near the harbor with a paper cup of black coffee warming his hands while Rex stared silently through the windshield. The dog had barely moved since sunset. Every few minutes his ears twitched toward the sea. Caleb followed his gaze toward the distant outline of the lighthouse standing alone against the rocky shoreline nearly 2 miles away. No lights. No movement. Just the dark shape of the tower cutting into the fog. "You really do not like that place," Caleb whispered. Rex let out a low rumble deep in his chest. Caleb leaned back against the worn seat and closed his eyes for a moment, but sleep never came easily anymore. Not after the war. Not after years of drifting from one town to another carrying memories heavier than the backpack in his truck bed. Some nights he still woke hearing helicopters that were not there. Some nights he heard voices from men he could not save. Grayhaven had been supposed to be another temporary stop. One more town before moving south for warmer weather. But something about the bakery felt different. Something about Margaret felt familiar in a way he could not explain. Just after midnight, Rex suddenly stood upright. The dog pressed his nose against the glass and released a sharp bark toward the harbor. Caleb immediately sat forward. Then he heard it again. The lighthouse horn. Long and low. Echoing across the black water. Caleb stepped out of the truck into freezing wind. The fog drifted through the empty streets in slow waves. Somewhere beyond the marina, the horn sounded a second time. "That is impossible," Caleb muttered under his breath. Earlier that day he had asked one of the dock workers about the Lighthouse. The old man nearly crossed himself before answering. The power had been disconnected decades ago after the keeper and his wife died during a winter storm. Nobody had lived there since. Nobody even maintained the road anymore. Yet the horn kept calling through the darkness like a voice refusing to disappear. Rex began pulling forward hard enough to tighten the leash. Easy, Caleb warned, but the German shepherd was already moving toward the waterfront. Together they walked past silent fishing boats and empty crab traps until they reached the far edge of the harbor where the cliffs overlooked the Atlantic. Wind whipped hard against Caleb's jacket. Waves crashed nearly 40 feet below against black rocks covered in foam. Then Caleb saw it. Far out through the fog, near the top of the lighthouse tower, a faint glow flickered behind the glass. Not steady. Not bright. But real. Caleb stared in disbelief. The light vanished almost immediately, swallowed again by darkness. Rex remained perfectly still beside him, focused completely on the tower. "What are you trying to show me?" Caleb whispered softly. Behind them, a voice suddenly spoke from the shadows near the dock stairs. "That lighthouse only wakes for people it remembers." Caleb turned sharply and saw an elderly fisherman standing beneath a dim street lamp wearing rubber boots and a faded red coat. His weathered face looked pale beneath the fog. "You should leave that place alone," the man said quietly. "Everyone who gets too close to it ends up carrying something back." Caleb frowned. "Like what?" The fisherman glanced toward Rex before answering. "The truth." Then he turned and disappeared slowly into the fog while somewhere far out at sea, the lighthouse horn sounded once more. By morning, the fog had settled so thick across Grayhaven that the ocean itself seemed to disappear. The cliffs beyond the harbor looked like shadows painted into the sky, and the lighthouse was nowhere to be seen. Caleb stood outside the bakery with a toolbox in one hand while Rex sniffed quietly along the sidewalk. The old wooden sign above the door creaked gently in the cold wind. Inside, the warmth wrapped around him. Immediately. Fresh coffee brewed near the counter. Cinnamon and baked apples drifted through the air. Margaret was already working slowly behind the kitchen table, her pale hands pressing dough with careful rhythm while an old vinyl record played soft piano music somewhere in the back room. "You came back early," she said without turning around. Caleb smiled faintly. "You always know when somebody walks in." "Not always," Margaret answered softly. "Only the ones carrying heavy things." Those words followed him through the morning as he repaired loose cabinets and replaced a leaking pipe beneath the sink. Rex never wandered far from Margaret. The dog stayed near her feet as though protecting her from something invisible. Around noon, the bakery grew quiet. The lunch crowd disappeared, and rain began tapping softly against the windows again. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and glanced toward the ocean through the fogged glass. "Last night," he said carefully, "I heard the lighthouse horn again." Margaret stopped moving. For several long seconds, only the sound of rain filled the room. Then she quietly folded the dish towel in her hands. "Some things do not stay buried forever," she whispered. Caleb studied her face. "People keep acting strange whenever I mention that place." Margaret slowly reached for a small tin container sitting near the shelves. Flour dust covered the faded blue lid. She opened it carefully and removed an old brass key attached to a weathered leather string. Even from across the room, Caleb could see the metal was worn smooth with age. Margaret turned the key over once in her fingers before holding it toward him. "Take this." Caleb frowned but did not move. "What is it?" "A door that has waited a very long time to open." The words landed strangely in the quiet bakery. Caleb stepped closer and accepted the key slowly. It felt cold despite the warmth inside the room. Heavy too. Like it belonged somewhere important. Rex suddenly stood up beside the counter and stared toward the back hallway. The fur along his neck lifted slightly. Caleb noticed it immediately. "Rex?" The dog remained completely still. Then came the sound. 3 soft knocks. Somewhere deep inside the building. Caleb looked toward the hallway. You expecting someone? Margaret's cloudy eyes lowered toward the floor. No one visits me anymore. Another knock echoed faintly through the bakery. Slow. Hollow. Like old wood shifting beneath distant footsteps. Caleb walked carefully toward the hallway, but when he opened the back storage room, nothing was there except shelves of canned peaches, flour sacks, and old baking trays. One small window rattled gently from the wind outside. Yet Rex would not stop staring. The German shepherd moved past Caleb into the room and pressed his nose against the floorboards near the far wall. Margaret appeared quietly behind them, gripping the doorway for support. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. That dog hears the sea differently than most creatures do. Caleb looked back at her. What does that mean? Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then she reached out and touched the brass key still resting in Caleb's hand. If the lighthouse calls again tonight, she said softly, do not ignore it. Outside, somewhere hidden beyond the fog and cliffs, a distant horn suddenly echoed across the gray Atlantic once more. The storm arrived just before sunset. Dark clouds rolled over Grayhaven in heavy layers, swallowing the last traces of daylight while cold rain hammered against the harbor docks. Fishing boats groaned against their ropes, and every shop on Harbor Street closed early except the bakery. Warm yellow light still glowed through the windows while wind rattled the old glass panes hard enough to make them tremble. Caleb stacked firewood beside the back door while Rex paced restlessly through the kitchen. The German shepherd had barely settled all afternoon. Every few minutes he stopped and stared toward the ocean with his ears raised sharply. Margaret sat quietly at the wooden table near the ovens, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The soft light made her look smaller somehow. Fragile. Like the storm outside was slowly pulling years from her body. You should stay somewhere safer tonight, Caleb said while closing the back door against the wind. Margaret smiled faintly. I have lived beside these storms my whole life. Another loud gust swept through the alley outside. The bakery lights flickered once. Caleb noticed Margaret's hands trembling slightly around the cup. Are you all right? He asked gently. She nodded at first, but her breathing sounded thinner now. Slower. Rex walked immediately to her side and rested his head against her knee. Margaret touched the dog softly behind his ears. He knows, she whispered. Caleb frowned. Knows what? Margaret turned her clouded eyes toward the sound of rain striking the windows. That some journeys only happen once. Before Caleb could answer, the lights suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the bakery except for the faint orange glow from the ovens. Thunder rolled across the ocean hard enough to shake the floor beneath them. Rex immediately stood alert. Somewhere beyond the storm, the lighthouse horn echoed again. Long deep. Calling through the rain. Caleb grabbed a flashlight from the counter drawer and switched it on. The narrow beam cut across shelves of bread and hanging pans. Margaret remained seated, calm despite the darkness around them. The power goes out every storm now, she said softly. But the lighthouse always wakes during weather like this. Caleb stepped closer to the front windows and looked toward the harbor, but the fog and rain hid everything beyond the streetlights. There is no electricity running to that tower, he said quietly. Margaret lowered her head slightly. Some lights are not powered by electricity. Silence filled the bakery after that. Only rain. Wind. The ticking wall clock. Then suddenly Margaret's teacup slipped from her hand and shattered across the floor. Caleb turned instantly. Her face had gone pale. One hand gripped the edge of the table tightly while her breathing became shallow. Margaret? She tried to answer but could not finish the words. Caleb rushed beside her as Rex whined anxiously near the doorway. I am calling an ambulance. Margaret weakly grabbed Caleb's sleeve before he could move away. Listen carefully, she whispered. Her voice sounded fragile now, almost carried away by the storm itself. Do not let them sell the lighthouse. Caleb stared at her in confusion. What are you talking about? Her fingers tightened slightly against his jacket. Promise me. Outside, lightning flashed somewhere over the ocean, and for one impossible second a bright beam of light swept across the bakery windows from far beyond the cliffs. Caleb froze. The lighthouse was shining again. Rex lifted his head and released a long mournful howl toward the sea while Margaret slowly closed her eyes beneath the sound of rain and distant thunder. The ambulance lights disappeared into the storm just after midnight, leaving Harbor Street swallowed once again by rain and darkness. Caleb stood beneath the bakery awning with Rex pressed close beside him while cold water dripped steadily from the edge of the roof. The lighthouse beam still moved slowly through the fog out beyond the cliffs, cutting across the ocean in silent rotations like a giant waking from decades of sleep. Even from nearly 2 miles away, the pale light felt impossible to ignore. Caleb looked down at the brass key still resting tightly in his hand. Rainwater slid across the worn metal. Margaret's final words echoed through him louder than the thunder. Do not let them sell the lighthouse. He barely slept that night. By sunrise, the storm had weakened into a cold mist drifting over the harbor. Grayhaven looked quieter than ever. The bakery remained dark. No smell of fresh bread. No soft music from the radio. Just silence behind the windows. Caleb sat inside his truck parked across the street while Rex watched the empty storefront without moving. Around noon, an unfamiliar black sedan stopped beside the curb. A tall man wearing a gray overcoat stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He paused outside the bakery, glanced toward Caleb, then walked across the wet pavement. Caleb Mercer, the man asked politely. Caleb nodded slowly. Who is asking? My name is Daniel Whitmore. I am Margaret Vale's attorney. Caleb stood beside the truck while wind carried the smell of rain and seawater through the street. How is she? The attorney lowered his eyes briefly. Margaret passed away early this morning at St. Agnes Hospital. The words landed softly, but something inside Caleb still tightened painfully. He glanced toward the dark bakery windows. Somehow he had expected her to still be inside waiting beside the ovens. Rex lowered his head quietly beside him. Daniel opened his briefcase and removed a folded document. There will be a small funeral tomorrow morning, he said gently. But there is another matter Margaret insisted I handle immediately. Caleb frowned. What kind of matter? The attorney unfolded the paper carefully. Margaret updated her will 3 weeks ago. Rain tapped softly against the parked cars lining Harbor Street while gulls circled above the docks. According to her final instructions, Daniel continued, ownership of the bakery and all remaining assets are to be transferred to you. Caleb stared at him in disbelief. That cannot be right. There is more. The attorney hesitated slightly before speaking again. Margaret also left you the lighthouse property on Blackwater Point. Even the harbor sound seemed to disappear for a moment. Caleb looked toward the ocean automatically. Somewhere beyond the gray fog, the lonely tower stood waiting above the cliffs. She barely knew me, Caleb whispered. Daniel studied him quietly. Margaret believed otherwise. Caleb shook his head slowly. Why would she leave something like that to a homeless stranger? The attorney closed the folder carefully. She told me there are some people the sea sends back for a reason. Before Caleb could respond, Rex suddenly stood alert beside the truck. The German shepherd stared toward the far edge of town where the coastal road curved north along the cliffs. Then he let out a low whine. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. For the briefest second, through shifting fog near the distant shoreline, he could see the lighthouse again. Dark against the pale sky. Waiting. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and handed Caleb a second envelope sealed with faded blue wax. Margaret asked me to give you this only after her passing. Caleb turned the envelope over slowly. Written across the front in delicate handwriting were only 6 words. For the man who finally returned home. The funeral took place beneath a gray morning sky that smelled of rain and seawater. Only 7 people came. 2 elderly women from the church. The attorney. A fisherman Caleb recognized from the harbor. And 3 quiet townspeople who stood near the back holding black umbrellas against the cold wind. Caleb remained beside the small gravesite with Rex sitting silently at his side while the minister spoke gentle words about kindness, faith, and the people who leave light behind after they are gone. Beyond the cemetery cliffs, the Atlantic rolled endlessly beneath heavy clouds. Somewhere far out near Blackwater Point, the lighthouse stood hidden in fog once again. Caleb kept thinking about how empty the bakery had felt without Margaret's voice inside it. Strange how a person could step into your life for only a few days and still leave silence behind that felt enormous. After the service ended, the others slowly drifted away toward their cars, but the old fisherman approached Caleb before leaving. His weathered face looked tired beneath the brim of his cap. "You going up there?" he asked quietly. Caleb knew immediately what he meant. "I guess I have to eventually." The fisherman nodded slowly toward Rex. "Take the dog with you. Animals know when a place remembers people." Then he walked away without another word. By late afternoon, Caleb finally stood at the beginning of the narrow coastal road leading toward Blackwater Point. The pavement had cracked badly over the years, and wild grass pushed through sections untouched for decades. Dark pine trees leaned over the cliffs while ocean wind carried the sharp smell of salt and wet stone. Rex jumped from the truck immediately, focused completely ahead. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and touched the brass key Margaret had given him. The lighthouse remained hidden around the far bend of the cliffs, but somehow Caleb already felt its presence waiting there. The drive took nearly 20 minutes through thick fog and rough coastal terrain. When the tower finally appeared, Caleb slowed the truck almost instinctively. The lighthouse rose from the edge of the cliffs like something from another century. White paint peeled from the stone walls. Rust streaked the narrow windows. Tall grass swayed wildly around the base while waves crashed nearly 60 feet below against black rocks. Beside the tower sat a small keeper's cottage weathered by decades of storms. Yet despite the decay, the place did not feel abandoned. It felt watchful. Rex stepped out first and immediately walked toward the front entrance without hesitation. Caleb followed slowly, boots crunching across wet gravel while cold wind moved through the cliffs with a low mournful sound. The brass key fit perfectly into the heavy iron lock. For a second Caleb hesitated. Then he turned it. The old wooden door groaned open inward. A smell of salt, dust, and aged wood drifted out from the darkness inside. Caleb switched on his flashlight. The narrow circular room was frozen in time. Old shelves lined the walls. A rusted lantern sat near the staircase. Framed black and white photographs covered one side of the room beneath layers of dust. Rex moved carefully across the floorboards, sniffing slowly before stopping near the bottom step of the spiral staircase leading upward through the tower. The dog looked back once toward Caleb as though urging him forward. Then Caleb noticed something strange. The lantern sitting near the stairs was warm. Not hot. But warm enough that someone should have touched it recently. Caleb frowned deeply and swept the flashlight around the empty room. "Hello?" he called out. Only the sound of waves answered him from below the cliffs. Yet somewhere higher inside the lighthouse, faintly above the wind, came the slow creak of footsteps moving across old wooden floors. Caleb stood frozen near the bottom of the spiral staircase while the sound above him slowly faded back into silence. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, though he could not tell whether it came from the cold or something deeper moving through him. Rex remained completely still beside the stairs, staring upward into the darkness. Then the German shepherd suddenly climbed the first few steps without hesitation. "Rex," Caleb whispered sharply, but the dog continued upward. The old wooden staircase creaked beneath Caleb's boots as he followed carefully behind. Wind moaned faintly through cracks in the stone tower walls while dust drifted through the narrow beam of light. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. Halfway up, Caleb noticed framed photographs hanging along the curved walls. Most were faded black and white pictures of ships, storms, and lighthouse keepers from another time. Then he stopped suddenly. One photograph near the landing showed a much younger Margaret standing beside a tall man in a navy uniform. Caleb moved the flashlight closer. His chest tightened instantly. He knew that face. The man beside Margaret looked almost exactly like the photograph Caleb carried in his wallet for over 20 years. His father. Thomas Mercer. Younger. Smiling. Alive. Caleb stared at the picture in disbelief while ocean wind whispered softly through the tower. "That is not possible," he murmured. Rex whined softly farther above him. Caleb forced himself to keep climbing. At the top of the tower, the circular lantern room opened around them beneath massive glass windows overlooking the Atlantic. Fog rolled endlessly across the dark ocean below while weak afternoon light filtered through the clouds. The giant lighthouse lens stood silent in the center of the room like a sleeping machine from another century. Everything was covered in dust except one thing. A small wooden table near the windows. Caleb walked toward it slowly. Resting on the table was a clean oil lantern beside an unopened journal wrapped carefully in cloth. No dust touched either object. Rex approached the table and lowered his nose near the journal before sitting quietly beside it. Caleb reached out and unfolded the cloth. Written across the faded leather cover were the words Keeper Records 1978. He opened the journal carefully. The first pages contained weather notes, supply lists, and old lighthouse maintenance entries written in neat handwriting. Then midway through the journal, Caleb found something different. A letter folded between the pages. His name written across the front. Caleb's breathing slowed. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Margaret's. "If you are reading this, then the lighthouse finally brought you home." Caleb lowered himself slowly into the nearby chair while rain tapped softly against the tower windows. The letter continued. "Your father saved my husband during the war in 1972. Their ship caught fire during a winter storm near the North Atlantic coast. Thomas carried him through smoke and freezing water when nobody else could reach him. My husband survived because of your father. But Thomas never made it home." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He had been only 8 years old when military officers came to their door. Most of his memories of his father were fragments now. A deep laugh. Strong hands. The smell of sea salt on old jackets. Margaret's words blurred slightly as Caleb continued reading. "Before your father deployed, he stayed here for 3 weeks while his ship underwent repairs. He told us stories about you every single night. He said if anything ever happened to him, he only wanted one thing for his son. A place where the world would stop hurting for a little while." Caleb swallowed hard while wind moved gently through the old tower around him. Then Rex suddenly stood and walked toward the far side of the lantern room. The dog scratched once against the wooden floorboards near the wall beneath the windows. Caleb looked up slowly. The sound beneath Rex's paws did not echo solid like the rest of the floor. It sounded hollow. Rex continued scratching softly against the wooden floorboards beneath the lantern room windows while ocean wind circled the tower with a low haunting whistle. Caleb knelt beside the dog and pressed his hand against the wood. Hollow. Definitely hollow. Years of military training had taught him how to notice hidden spaces, false panels, and things people buried beneath ordinary surfaces. He swept the flashlight carefully along the seams until he spotted a small iron ring nearly invisible beneath layers of dust. Caleb hooked his fingers through it and pulled upward slowly. The hidden panel groaned open, revealing a narrow compartment beneath the floor. A rush of cold air drifted upward carrying the scent of cedar wood and old paper. Inside rested a small weatherproof chest wrapped in canvas. Rex stepped back quietly as Caleb lifted it out. Onto the floorboards. His hands shook slightly now. Not from fear. From something deeper. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. Caleb unlatched the chest carefully. Inside were dozens of neatly bundled letters, old Navy photographs, a folded American flag, and a silver pocket watch stopped permanently at 2:17. Beneath them rested a smaller envelope with faded handwriting across the front. For Caleb. From Thomas Mercer. Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. Slowly, almost afraid to touch it, he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained steady and strong. Son, if you are reading this, then life carried you farther from home than I ever wanted. Caleb lowered his head as wind rattled softly against the lighthouse glass. I do not know what kind of man you became. I only know that the world can wound good people in ways they never deserve. If that ever happens to you, I hope this lighthouse gives you what every man needs eventually. A safe harbor. Caleb swallowed hard. His father's words felt impossibly alive inside the silent tower. Thomas continued writing about the weeks he spent repairing naval equipment near Grayhaven before deployment. He wrote about Margaret and her husband Elias. About late nights drinking coffee beside the lantern room while storms crashed against the cliffs. About promises made between friends who believed they still had time left in life. Then Caleb reached the final page. If I do not come home, Elias promised this lighthouse would always remain for you. Not as property. Not as money. As a place where pain could finally stop following you. Caleb closed his eyes tightly as emotion moved through him like a wave he could no longer hold back. For years he had wandered from town to town carrying grief like extra weight on his back. Failed marriage. Sleepless nights. Forgotten birthdays. Empty motel rooms. Faces from the war that never truly disappeared. Somewhere along the way, he stopped believing there was any place left in the world meant for him. Yet somehow his father had thought about him all those years ago while standing in this exact tower above the sea. Rex gently rested his head against Caleb's shoulder. The simple warmth of the dog beside him nearly broke him completely. Outside, the storm clouds had finally begun to clear. Faint late-afternoon sunlight spilled through the lighthouse windows in long golden beams across the dusty floor. Caleb looked down into the chest once more and noticed one final object hidden beneath the letters. A folded map of the property. Marked carefully in red ink near the keeper's cottage was a single sentence written by Margaret. The bakery was never the inheritance. Home was. Hours later, as evening settled over the Atlantic, the lighthouse beam slowly turned once more across the darkening ocean. Down in Grayhaven harbor, fishermen looked up in silence as light touched the water for the first time in decades. And high above the cliffs, Caleb stood beside